Hello, ni hao. Welcome everyone. I'm Sean Purdy and I'll be your moderator today for this offshore wind webinar. We're going to focus on China, and that focus will include some facts and details about what is happening regarding offshore wind in China, and also what's happening globally, regionally, that could be of interest and hopefully is of interest to those people on the call today outside of China. So today there'll be some introductory slides from myself. There'll be some two presentations, one by my colleague Cathy Yang from ERM, one from RCG, Yuan Lu, and the three presenters will entertain you with facts and figures, and will be followed by a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. There'll also be some polling questions, which will hopefully set the scene for some discussion and questions at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, the introduction will be by myself. Then I'll speak about some general trends around offshore wind globally. Then the first presentation will be on the technical side, on environmental side of global and offshore wind market status. Then there'll be a technical presentation on offshore wind in the region, followed by a Q&A session. Next slide, please. So during the presentation, we encourage you to ask questions. There's a button at the bottom of your screen with Q&A. You can post your questions at any time using the Q&A function. We'll discuss the questions at the end of the presentation. The webinar will be recorded, will be used for ERM internal purposes. However, the presentation material will be available to all people who registered and attended the webinar. Okay, we've enabled the transcript feature, so simply click on the bottom to see subtitles as you go along. If you have any further questions after the presentation, after the webinar, feel free to make comments at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that this webinar will be a combination of not just environmental and social aspects of wind powered development, which is the specialty of ERM, but we've also got and welcoming a new company that is now part of the ERM family, RCG, Renewables Consulting Group, a technical advisory specialist specializing in renewables and particularly in offshore wind in North Asia. Next slide, please. So just an update on where renewable energy is heading. The whole decarbonisation, post-COP26, investor appetite for renewables globally continues to be strong. COVID-19 is obviously affecting development of all types of infrastructure, and it's hurting global renewable energy growth, but not halting it. So despite some economic uncertainties, Renewables for electricity generation is projected to have grown around 7% in 2020 and is on track for a record expansion of up to 10% in 2021. Next slide, please. Just to give some context of the development of turbines, the sizes of offshore wind turbines from 2010, our projected sizes up to 2030. What does this actually mean? It means that there's going to be more issues associated with bird strike, bird migratory patterns, monitoring what's going on, potentially having to stop turbines in some jurisdictions because of migratory birds. Flight paths will be affected more as the height of turbines increases. There'll be greater safety issues during construction and operation stages. And shipping lanes, as the size of the turbines, the size of the offshore wind developments themselves gets larger, it'll impact on access across the oceans. One fact I'd like to mention is there's projections on the growth of offshore wind. First projection is regarding offshore oil and gas. So by 2030, the offshore oil and gas market expenditure, so not just capital expenditure, but operating expenditure, total expenditure of offshore oil and gas by 2030 will increase slightly to $140 billion US. However, offshore wind market expenditure is projected to increase to 87 billion. So obviously not as large as oil and gas still, but significantly increasing by multiples and approaching the capacity of the offshore wind market. Next slide, please. So where is offshore wind going to? It's not just going to be used for electricity production. It's going to be used to facilitate decarbonisation otherwise. We've all heard about the discussions about green hydrogen. The cost of green hydrogen is high at the moment, but the interest, the announcement of new developments, the announcement of improved technology is accelerating. We've all been monitoring and watching the media and reports on where green hydrogen is going. And utilizing offshore wind to generate green hydrogen via electrolysis is certainly an increasing opportunity for a number of us. My final slide, coming up. One of the other areas that we're very active in at ERM is the safety side. So again, as the size of offshore wind developments increases and the depth of water where the installations occur increases, it's going to be more considerations required for safety in line with the potential for death or life-changing injury. So it's certainly a factor that has to be considered in the development of offshore wind. Next slide, please. 4 polling questions. The first one, just coming up now. We see activity in Korea, Japan, and China markets. And just to get the audience in the mood, we're going to ask your company, where do you see the most offshore wind project development activities? You could be in a construction company, an equipment supplier, a developer, a financial institution, etc. Just click on one of those boxes. It'll be open for about a minute, and then we'll just see people on this call where they believe the most action for them will happen in the next 12 months. Not unexpectedly, people on this China call believe that there's going to be most work and interest in the China offshore wind market. So thank you for those who answered that question. Next polling question, slightly different. Outside of Korea, those three countries, next question coming up, within Asia Pacific, where do you see the next biggest offshore wind development opportunity for your company? Vietnam, Australia, Philippines, India, or another? Okay, neck and neck. We have Vietnam and a vote for others. So maybe you might like to, if anyone wants to ask a question, they can also say which other jurisdiction they think there might be some more activity. It could be Indonesia, for example. Just for your interest, the reason on the first question we had Korea followed by Japan followed by China is that's a chronological order of our three webinars. So the first webinar we had last week on Korea, and this one, the Japan polling question during the Japan webinar, the answer was Vietnam. So there's hopefully some useful information for you on this poll. Okay, now we're going to get on to our presenters. First presenter is Dr. Kathy Young, a partner with ERM. She is a PhD in economics from the Australian National University and has an extensive global experience in consulting projects in power, new energy, oil and gas, chemicals, minerals and metals, and the infrastructure sector. She's 10 years of academic and industrial experience in climate policy and sustainable project delivery in Australia, and 8 years in China in leading global teams across multicultural geographical locations to deliver a range of international projects. She's worked in all sorts of areas in all sorts of countries, which are detailed at the end of this presentation, but I think you're very interested to hear what she has to say. She's worked across many different technologies. She's based in our Beijing office. And Kathy, would you like to start your presentation? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Sean. Good afternoon, everyone. It is Kathy Young from ERM Beijing office, working closely with Chinese and international clients on renewables and low carbon economy transition business. As introduced by Sean earlier, so today's presentation is mainly introducing how ERM help Chinese clients mitigate environmental and technical risks in overseas offshore wind investments and project developments. I'll be presenting on two topics today. The first is an overview of global and China offshore wind markets, and the second involves environmental and social impact assessment and risks mitigation associated with your offshore wind developments in overseas countries. Or take Vietnam as an example. My colleague Ewan Lu in Glasgow office from RCG will talk about technical risks later. Okay, next slide. So quickly about our company ERM. So Environmental Resource Management is a global leading pure play sustainability and climate change consulting company, headquartered in the UK with over a 50-year history, having more than 5,500 professionals and consultants in 160 offices across 40 countries. So we have advised more than 50% of Fortune Global 500 companies on environmental and sustainability. And we are ranked the second in the ENR Global Top 200 Environmental Management Firms in 2021. We have partnered with leading international organizations such as WBCSD, GRI, TCFD to develop and review international frameworks and guidelines related to sustainable development. So we have in China, Greater China, we have over 200 consultants employed in 5 offices, including Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And our goal is to shape a sustainable future with the world's leading organizations. Next slide. So regarding global, next slide. So regarding global new energy experience, we have delivered more than 1,500 projects in the past 10 years, covering more than 100 countries around the world, involving various sources of new energy, including solar, wind, energy storage, biofuels, hydrogen, power transmission and distribution, electrification, and hydropower. Next one. Next slide, please. So in terms of offshore wind experience, we have involved in more than 50 offshore wind projects with a total capacity of over 10 gigawatts around the world over past 10 years. So this image shows a couple of project examples only, say in the UK, US, India, Japan, China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. So the main services we provide include site selection, feasibility studies, M&A due diligence, environmental and social impact assessment, front-end design, technical risks, safety consulting, climate risk assessment, Equator Principle review, permit approval, EHS management, and monitoring and training, etc., across the whole project lifecycle. Next slide. So now let's look at global and China offshore wind market status and outlook. Next slide. Okay, so here are two diagrams showing global total installed offshore wind capacity and new installed offshore wind capacity in 2020. So it can be seen from the figure, let's see on the right first. So the global offshore market has grown rapidly, on average of by 22% each year in the past decade, bringing total installations to 35.3 gigawatts, which accounted for 5% of total global wind capacity as of the end of 2020. Europe remains the largest offshore wind market, making up 70% of total global offshore wind installations. And UK remains the top spot globally in terms of cumulative offshore wind capacity as of 2020, while China has overtaken Germany to become the world's second largest offshore wind market. The figure on the left shows the global offshore wind industry installed 6.1 gigawatts of capacity last year, of which China added over 3 gigawatts last year, despite the impact of COVID-19. So accounting for half of the global tally. And then the Netherlands are nearly 1.5 gigawatts, and Belgium about 706 megawatts were the next two countries to follow. So for China, new capacity in 2021 is likely to be more than double as Chinese offshore wind industry undergoes a rush to bring projects online before the end of 2021 deadline in order to capitalize on the 85 cents RMB per kilowatt hour feed-in tariff for offshore wind. If this happens as expected, so China will surpass the UK as the world's largest offshore wind market in total installations. So however, new installations in China are expected to decline sharply from 2022 when support from central government will be terminated. Okay, if we move on to next slide. Let's look at the global market outlook to 2030. The global offshore wind market has grown even more promising over the past 12 months because governments across the world continue to raise their ambition levels and also the sharp drop of offshore wind LCOE, levelized cost of electricity, made it one of the most competitive energy sources. Also, progress continued in commercialization and industrialization for floating wind. And offshore wind increasingly played a unique role in facilitating cross-industry cooperation and decarbonization, such as oil and gas sector transition to renewables and power to X. As you can see from the figure, with a compound annual growth rate of nearly 30% until 2025 and 13% up to the end of 2030, new annual installations are expected to surpass the milestone of 20 gigawatts in 2025 and potentially 40 gigawatts in 2030. And expected the total offshore wind capacity may exceed 270 gigawatts by 2030. So Europe remains its status as the largest regional offshore wind market as of 2020, but new installations outside Europe, predominantly in Asia, already surpassed Europe last year for the first time. This situation is likely to remain through to 2030. Now let's look at Asia market outlook in more details. Next slide, please. So Asia actually built the first offshore wind project, only 1.3 megawatts in Japan in 2003, but the regional offshore market was not ready to take off until 2014, when Chinese National Energy Administration, NEA, released the National Offshore Wind Development Plan for 2014 to 2016. And as mentioned, so last year, Asia replaced Europe as the leading regional offshore wind market in the new installations for the first time. So GWEC, our Global Wind Energy Council, our latest market outlook predicts that China will continue to install the lion's share of offshore in Asia in the first half of this decade. However, the market will become more diversified from 2025 onwards, when more large-scale offshore wind projects are set to be commercialized in Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam. By the way, so we have just held another 2 offshore wind webinars for South Korea and Japan respectively last week. So if anyone is interested in having a copy or recording of those webinars, feel free to reach out to me or to our marketing contacts. Okay, next slide. Now let's move on to talk about environmental and social risks associated with offshore wind projects, with a focus on comparing what we call regulatory EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment, and internationally recognized ESIA, Environmental and Social Impact Assessment. This will help Chinese clients to understand and mitigate or even avoid some critical environmental related risks at the project development stages, particularly for overseas project and outbound investments. Next slide, please. So as we all know, when developing overseas projects, the developers will most likely need to engage with international financial institutions. Large infrastructure and industrial projects can have adverse impacts on people and the environment, driven by the pressure from regulators, social and peers, and increasing needs of sustainability performance index and environment and social risk management. Financial institutions seek to identify, assess, and manage environmental and social risks and impacts in a structured way when financing projects. So now the Equator Principles, what we call EP, are intended to serve as this common baseline and risk management framework for financial institutions to address these risks. So actually the number of financial institutions adopting Equator Principles has increased significantly at an average growth rate of 12%. Now a total of 126 financial institutions in 38 countries have officially adopted Equator Principles. European Union takes the lead, followed by Asia. Next slide, please. Now, an overview of EP, Equator Principles. So the EPs are a voluntary set of principles underpinned by the International Finance Corporation, IFC, performance standards. We already mentioned EP4. Equator Principles, actually they are updated every several years, and currently the latest iteration effective from 1st of October 2020, so just last year. It was transitioned from the last version in 2013, known as EP3. So although the EPs are not mandatory legal requirements, the fact that over 100 banks and financial institutions worldwide, and the figure continues to grow, have signed up to the Equator Principles, meaning they have agreed to comply with these standards and have undertaken not to provide loans for the development of a project where project sponsors refuse or are unable to demonstrate that the project will be constructed and operated in accordance with the environmental, social, and governance considerations set out in the Equator Principles. According to the IFC standards, projects categorized according to their environmental and social risks based on screening criteria A, B, or C. So category A refers to project with potential significant adverse social and environmental impacts that are diverse, irreversible, or unprecedented. Category B refers to projects with potential limited adverse social or environmental impacts that are few in number, generally site-specific, largely reversible, and readily addressed through mitigation measures. Category C refers to projects with minimal or no social and environmental impacts. Now, wind energy could be category A, B, or C. So rationale for A would include like resettlement and footprint over sensitive area, heritage sites, for example, large footprint of offshore wind farm, as well as large offshore development. Next slide, please. So here is an overview of the Equator Principles, total of 10 principles, and how they are linked to IFC performance standards, so total of 8 standards, as well as the IFC EHS guidelines. So I won't go through the details of these principles and standards today. These are publicly available on the official website of Equator Principle and IFC. But I'm going to mention some updates from the newly released EP4 compared to the last EP3. Okay, next slide. So the finalized Equator Principle 4 contains several significant additions. One of key changes is greater emphasis on recommendations from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD. So EP4 acknowledges the risks posed by climate change within project financing and increases reporting requirements through 4 measures. It's now recognized the role of Equator Principle financial institutions in achieving the goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement. This emphasis may be relevant for host countries striving to ensure that project development complies with nationally determined contributions, NDCs, under the Paris Agreement. ESIA, so Environmental, Social, and Impact Assessment, are now mandated to include Climate Change Risk Assessment, or CCRA. So all Category A projects and as appropriate Category B projects, so the CCRA must analyze climate physical risks. And all projects where combined Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions are likely to exceed 100,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, the CCRA must review climate transition risks, such as those arising from a move to a low carbon economy and evaluate potential alternatives to the project that are less greenhouse gas intensive. EP4 also indicates that ESIAs must consider project compatibility with the relevant climate and energy policies of the host country, including its NDCs, so nationally determined contributions. And TCFD recommendations are now explicitly recognized in this EP4, as well as in reference to reporting metrics, though not directly requiring climate change risk assessment to be carried out in accordance with TCFD recommendations, but EP4 mandates the assessment of physical and transitional climate risks as defined by the TCFD. So by the way, please allow me to mention that ERM has special contribution to the internationally recognized TCFD framework. ERM wrote the technical supplement on the use of scenario analysis in relation to climate-related financial risks and opportunities to determine strategic response options. ERM is recommended consultants by TCFD. So lastly, in terms of disclosure requirements, EP4 indicates that EPFIs, so in Equator Principle financial institutions, must require borrowers to report annually on greenhouse gas emission levels and provide a greenhouse gas efficiency ratio where appropriate. Next slide, please. So now we understand why we need to do ESIA. Now the question will be, what are the differences or typical gaps between a local regulatory EIA, environmental impact assessment, and internationally recognized ESIA by EP, Equator Principle, by IFC, and many other financial institutions and organizations. Basically, and in almost all cases, ESIA has higher or more stringent requirements in assessing the environmental and social risks than regulatory EIAs. So start by biodiversity. In terms of frequency of survey requirements, seasonal data may be sufficient for EIA, but ESIA will request monthly data. Methodology required to monitoring and assessing impacts on migratory birds and marine mammals are different. The species to be considered are different. EIA only considers local recognized species, while ESIA considered at a wide international level. There are also gaps in developing critical habitats assessment and management plans, such as biodiversity action plan. Next slide. There are also big gaps in social and stakeholder management. Local regulatory EIAs, social chapter, mainly based on literature review of demographic data or nearby communities, where international ESIA social chapter will be in a lot more depth and details, and the scope is much bigger. In terms of defining stakeholder, local EIA mainly focus on, for offshore wind, maybe focus on fishermen only, whereas the international ESI definition of stakeholders is much wider. It's also absence of stakeholder engagement plan and the consideration of livelihood impact and its restoration plan in a regulatory EIA. Okay, next slide. So we also mentioned about climate change. So in terms of international ESIA, it requires climate change risk assessment. They will ask you about physical risk, transition risks, what are extreme weather events, flooding, drought, what are the impacts, and what are the alternative options to mitigate the impacts in line with TCFD, as we talked earlier. And also human rights impact assessment is also part of ESIA, identifying, understanding, assessing, and addressing the adverse effects of the project or activities on the human rights in line with the United Nations guiding principles business and human rights, UNGPs. For example, in fishery industry, so a foreign worker gets physical compensation may open up human rights issues in the eye of international organizations. Next slide. And also cumulative impact assessments are almost non-touched in a regulatory EIA. And also in ESIA, lenders will ask the developer to consider alternative assessments and evaluate technically, financially feasible, and cost-effective options to reduce and minimize project-related environmental and social impact. Next slide. In terms of field management, there are also significant gaps, such as safety requirements and some standard documents and anti-bribery and corruption as well. And some practice may be taken as market standard in local EIA, but can be challenging in an international ESIA. And also some gaps in the level of quality of field and progress reporting. So now we have seen that there are typical gaps in biodiversity, social, climate change, human rights, cumulative impact, field management between EIA and ESIA. Therefore, it's recommended to make clear as early as possible you can on what standards will apply for your project developments to avoid your project delay. Next, I'll quickly take Vietnam offshore wind as an example. Okay, so for Vietnam, the key gaps between regulatory EIA and ESIA lie in, so in EIA, there's no specific requirement on biodiversity and social aspects, i.e. baseline collection and impact assessment. Also, there's limited community consultation and engagement, and there's lack of an appropriate environmental and social management system, ESMS, and monitoring program. Next slide. There are big impacts on Vietnam terrestrial biodiversity from offshore wind. Vietnam is located within the bird migratory patterns, and offshore wind projects in the Mekong Delta could impact on two migratory bird species, which are critically endangered, spoon-billed sandpiper and endangered Nordmann's green shank. And mangrove area is likely to be cleared due to landfall point, transmission line, and access to road and access to bridge. Next slide. Also to aquatic biodiversity, there will be impacts to the endangered Irrawaddy dolphin due to underwater noise, pile driving, marine traffic, and submarine cable installations, increasing risk of injury and resulting in behavioral changes like temporary displacement. There will also be impact to the endangered hairy-nosed otter due to habitat loss, mangrove area, and hunting from the influx. Next slide. For the ecosystem service, there will be permanently or temporarily restrict agriculture activities along the mudflat, like clam farming or coastal areas, shrimp farming. The offshore wind projects will also limit access to fishing grounds by the presence of access bridges to turbines. Next slide. And for the social aspects, there are no regulatory requirements in Vietnam on compensation or support for fishermen whose income is lost or reduced due to the restriction to the fishing ground. a socioeconomic baseline, coastal and offshore of incomes to determine if the IFC Performance Standards 5 requirement of restoring livelihood to pre-displacement levels will be met has not been established. And offshore construction is probably to impact marine, water, and coastal ecology, thereby affecting fisher and other marine resources on which indigenous people livelihood depends. And also lack of community grievance mechanism to obtain any feedback, concerns of local people on the project, for example, disturbance from the project construction safety zone in the marine area. Okay, so here are some practical steps. So firstly, understand key risks early in the project screening. And secondly, be clear as you can early on what standards will apply, whether it's regulatory EIA or international ESIA. Thirdly, consider the approval strategy where you can link the EIA and ESIA process so the baseline data collection can be used for both local EIA and ESIA. So this will be cost and time saving. Lastly, work closely with the local partners during the ESIA process and project development phases. So, okay, so this is the end of my presentation. So I'll hand over back to Sean. And Sean, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy. And I did appreciate that you were able to bring in the context of Vietnam, which is, I'm sure, of interest to a lot of people on this webinar because of the announcements being made by the Vietnamese government recently. And I've personally been working in the Asian power sector for over 20 years. And if you'd said to me 3 years ago that the amount of renewables that was going to be installed in Vietnam was happening, I just wouldn't have believed it. As a lot of people on this call know, Vietnam decision-making process can take a long time, but it's just amazing how much now that they're looking to invest in all types of renewables technology. So thanks again, Kathy. Next, we've got a couple more polling questions. These are based more on the technical and environmental side. So the first one is, what do you think is the biggest challenge to deliver offshore wind in Asia? These are quite general, just across the entire region. What do you think is the biggest challenge for you? I think that knowledge would mean knowledge of local conditions, knowledge of local regulations, knowledge of what's going on wherever you're looking to invest. I can't vote on these questions either, so or anyone from ERM or RCG on the speaking. So we can't influence anything. Okay, thanks. It's interesting. Two front runners, and I possibly would have suspected that supply chain would have been one of the front runners there. So site conditions, of course, with some of the increasing depth that we're seeing, particularly in North Asia, requiring things such as floating offshore wind options, etc., and supply chain, local capacity, local experience, etc. Two very valid answers there. Okay, we'll go on to the poll question number 4, please. Please select 3 of your top environmental and social concerns. So you can pick any 3 of those options: fishery community, migratory birds, etc. Okay, thanks for your input there. A little more spread out, but I think I would have expected fishery and community opposition to be high on the list, and so it seemed 12 out of 15 respondents picked that as an issue, and environmental or social issues. Well, that was a number 2, and obviously there's people on this call who can help you with that. I thought possibly visual impact, but then when you consider that the majority of these offshore wind projects are going to be further out to sea, and we're talking about distances in terms of hundreds of meters to kilometers offshore, that was why we probably got a 0% there. Okay, we're going to go on now to our second speaker, or second serious speaker after Kathy, and that is going to be a presentation from Yiwen Lu, who's a senior associate based in RCG's Glasgow office with a background in naval architecture. She has managed and supported international due diligence assignments for both onshore and offshore, including floating wind projects across European and APAC markets. An experienced consultant in renewable energy advisory work, wind technical due diligence, and she also worked as Lender's technical advisor across APAC and Europe. So thank you very much, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Sean, and hello everyone. Next slide, please. So before I start, please also allow me to give a brief introduction of RCG. Next slide. RCG is a specialized expert service firm focused on the global renewable energy industry. In RCG, we worked with our clients to help them create a low carbon world. I'm very happy in July this year, RCG became a part of the ERM Group. So now we can work together to provide bespoke services to our clients. And this is also why I'm co-speaking with Kathy for this webinar today. RCG can provide market intelligence, management, consulting, and technical advisory services throughout the whole project life cycle. Our management consulting services include strategy and commercial advisory, market advisory, and safety and risk advisory. Our technical advisory capability includes, but is not limited to, set identification and selection, LCOE modeling, vendors and acquisition due diligence works, energy yield assessment, asset optimization, and we can also act as the lender's technical advisor and owner's engineer. Next slide, please. So Kathy has explained the current China market, and I will go straight into the technical risks. Understanding the technical risks is an essential part of project development and realization. These following aspects should be bear in mind. There are risks on every project which can result in delays. Risks should be categorized based on the extent to which they could affect a project schedule and budget, even the revenue. Understanding key risks at the early stage of the project development is a key, but it is not always possible. Risk register will form the basis of quantitative risk assessment, which is QRA, in order to determine a reasonable CapEx contingency linked to risks and construction delays. Construction delays can impact the project's financial performance during and post-construction. Project delays can typically be caused by a range of issues rather than just one major event. Next slide, please. To better assess the technical risks, we should consider the construction contract strategy and specific contractual terms alongside with potential project delays, both in terms of identifying contract risks which could impact schedules and being aware of potential delay mitigation measures. In general, we've seen three main contracting strategies as follows. The first one is a single EPC wrap, where large parts of the construction are packed together and contracted to one organization. And this organization typically subcontracts different parts of its scope to different subcontractors. And the second one is a multi-EPCI arrangement, where the whole scope is shared between 2 to 6 parties. The chart below is a typical multi-EPCI arrangement, including 3 packages, covering onshore works, offshore BOP works, and turbine works. Then the third one is a multi-contract approach, where the developer signs contracts with individual contractors for detailed scopes. In this arrangement, normally the developer takes more risk and responsibility. When determining which contractual structure to select, interface risk is a key consideration. If a very experienced EPCI contractor is appointed, then there is a benefit to the project that only one party is responsible for delivering the project on time. The more contracts you have, the higher the interface risk, which can lead to an increased risk of delay. In general, early in the market development, single EPC rep was most common, like in China. I believe one of the reasons is also because there are big state-owned offshore EPCI contractors and state-owned developers, EPCI subcompanies, which are all active in the Chinese offshore wind industry. Those include, but not limited to, the following. Meanwhile, in a more mature market, like in Europe, the majority of the projects are actually using multi-contract approach, which is usually at a lower cost. Next slide, please. Regardless of contract structure, there are some key contract provisions to consider from a schedule delay perspective. Due to the time constraints, I won't be able to get into details today for each single one, but I want to mention a few key areas. The first one is the allocation of ground and weather risks. Basically, which party is responsible for these risks and to what level. Understanding this leads to a better ability to quantify and manage the risk when it happens. Contractors will typically take both the ground risks and weather risks up to a great number of weather days. And then the final one is delay liquidated damages, i.e. LDs. This is a key provision for penalizing the contractor for delays. It should be carefully considered where the milestone under which LD apply, and the LD rates as well as the overall LD cap. Delay LDs are to protect against the knock-on impacts to other work packages, and also for the final COD delays. Next slide, please. So, apart from looking into the key contract provisions to protect the project from construction delays, below are different methods and tools which can be used to track the project construction progress and delays. On the right-hand side, I put in an example of construction schedule for an 500 megawatts offshore wind project, which provides some indication of the typical sequence of the works and the durations for such projects in the UK. Although it should be mentioned that currently in China, the sequence of work and the durations are very condensed due to the subsidy deadline, which can lead to further HSE incidents and may create future qualities. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to move to the technical risks we have seen during the construction phase. Next slide, please. Many of these risks are becoming better known and mitigated against as the industry continues to mature. General risks include civil risks, which mainly refers to unforeseen ground and seabed conditions, and grid connection delays are normally due to third-party delays. And COVID-19 delay are actually quite new, but we have seen it affect different projects in the past year. Basically, the outbreaks in different regions have led to material shortages, shutdown at the fabrication facilities, and personal shortages. The high impact risks in the middle are the most common key aspects that we considered have potential to go very wrong in offshore wind project delivery, based on our experience of these issues having occurred on projects in the recent years. Therefore, the relevant mitigation measures should be put in place at the project development stage. Then on the right-hand side, there are some specific considerations should be kept in mind for the Chinese market, such as limited in-country knowledge based on the design and management of major infrastructure projects in deep water offshore environment, and safely conducting marine operations, lack of experienced technicians, lack of offshore wind installation standards, risk management system, and HSE standards and practice. Also, the insufficient development and condensed construction time due to the national subsidy deadline, which I think everyone understands is by the end of this year. And the next one is conflicting standards between the domestic turbine type certification and the international certification, which is very important when the Chinese company try to go overseas. And limited suitable vessels is also a problem, which is actually a universal problem. Next slide. So I will talk about two key construction issues that already caused incidents in China. The first one is the vessel risks. This is related to site accessibility, which refers to the complex sea states in Chinese offshore sites, for instance, in Guangdong and Fujian provinces. Then market expansion globally has seen an increase in demanding for offshore installation vessels. Also, as turbine size increases, minimum vessel requirements such as deck space and crane loads increase for vessels performing the transportation and installation of these turbines. In addition, although it is not hard to charter a vessel during the early project development phase, projects close to construction or in construction phase that require replacement vessel can facing difficulty sourcing. Vessel failures can also happen during construction. And the minor issue may require the component replacement only, which can delay the project by days or weeks. Well, the significant issues may require a replacement vessel, which can delay the project by even months. On the left side, there are a number of accidents happened in China this year and last year during the rapid construction for achieving the subsidy deadline. And I only pick up 3 recent ones and to show it on the left-hand side. The investigation, the first one is in July this year in Guangdong province. A jackup vessel has tilted and half sank while operating in a wind farm. 4 people were missing. The investigation of this accident is still ongoing, although it may be a punch through of one of jackup legs into seabed. And last year, in Jiangsu province, a jackup vessel had been flooded while operating in the wind farm. The cause is that the tail leg was not successfully pulled out to lift the vessel. Meanwhile, the watertight gates failed, resulting in the cabin floating. And also last year in Guangdong province, a heavy lifting vessel broke its boom while installing pin panels, although no one injured. The cause is due to a damaged critical component of the lifting brake. Next slide, please. The second key construction risks I'm going to talk about is related to electrical balance of plant, which includes follow risks, weather network reinforcement and grid absorption capacity, long lead time for export cables, which should require early commitment, challenge soil conditions, which can cause issues in achieving the target depth below seabed of cables, and cable damage during construction, for example, kinks, causing bird caging. Also weather delays and knock-on effects on every cable installation if the foundation are delayed. For example, out of sequence installation. One accident happened in China is related to an offshore substation in the past, which is shown on the right-hand side. It was in Jiangsu province. A cable explosion occurred at the wind farm substation, and 19 personnel jumped into the sea to escape, but only 18 were alive at the least. The cause of this accident is actually weather disaster, a thunderstorm, which led to a 35 kV cable failing, and personnel escaped after being unable to bring the original fire under control. Well, the focus of this presentation is to ensure the project delivery stays on schedule. I will also give a light touch on the operational risks and upcoming challenges of the floating wind development. Next slide. Most Chinese offshore wind projects still have a valid turbine O&M contracts, which means that the turbine original supplier is still in charge of the O&M activities. However, in a few years' time, after the initial term has ended, developers are likely to bring O&M in-house, where the following key and most common operational risks should be carefully considered, as they can lead to significant outages, costly repairs, and potential loss of revenue. For turbines, we should be careful with the major components failures and serial defects, as well as the failures happen in nacelle. For blades, there are risks that they may have mechanical failures, damaged by lightning, leading edge erosion, and icing problems in certain areas. For electrical system, we may face risks related to cable failures and common issues such as main transformer failures, which may have a long lead times to recover, and then the turbine converter failures, which should be covered by the warranty availability, or it can be replaced relatively quickly. For geotechnical and geophysical issues, they include the misestimation of ground capacity, which may lead to increased loading in foundation. Although this can be monitored by the turbine sensors to confirm if the natural frequency is outside the acceptable range or not. And there's a risk of underestimation of soil resistance to driving, leading to higher energies required during paddling, which can consume a greater fatigue life than the design allowance. This can impact the operational design lifetime of the asset, which requiring detailed monitoring and investigations. Also, there is a risk of underestimate of seabed mobility levels, leading to overexposure of the foundation or cables. This would require retrofit of score protection or cable mattressing, which can greatly increase OPEX costs. Under electrical and grid connections, issues include transmission risks, which related to cable failures caused by poor installations, design, and manufacturing. The average repair time is normally about 2 months. Then the outage compensation regulation varies in different countries, and in the UK, developers are not compensated for outages in the offshore link. However, certain mechanisms are put in place to reduce this risk. And the general practice in Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark is that the developers are protected from the outages in the offshore links, although not fully. For the curtailment, it can happen either due to the bottlenecks, outages, or maintenance actions in the onshore transmission system. Shorter duration maintenance actions are usually not compensated, but can be mitigated through cooperation with the grid owner to understand the timing of the. Next slide, please. And next slide. We are facing further challenges for floating wind projects, and it is expected mitigation measures will be put in place as industry continues to mature. For infrastructure, port, and logistics, floating wind projects would require larger marine vessels rate to carry the floating substructure. And the upgrade of existing port facilities would be required. However, the following issues should be considered during the project development phase. For floating structure, there is no current standardization due to the multi-floating structure concepts, and its manufacturing could take up to 2 years for a commercial scale project, which is around 400 and 500 megawatts. For mooring system, it would require significant numbers of moorings to be manufactured, handled, and installed. The hookup and disconnect process is critical for installation process, and the pulling loads can be very high, especially for non-redundant systems. Component fatigue will be different, and as they have different loadings compared to the oil and gas industry. And the corrosion and the marine growth in the new regions or countries should be considered in design. For floating wind constructions, there will be significant numbers of components to be connected and installed, both on the surface and subsea. There would be potential bottlenecks for future vessel availability, especially due to the competition from oil, gas, and increasing numbers of floating wind projects. Cabotage rules in new markets should be considered as well. For example, the Drone Act in the US market. For floating wind, O&M, which is operational and maintenance, the heavy maintenance should be considered for major components replacement, and the asset integrity healthy monitoring is also important. There is, at the moment, there is a limited check of record and experience to conduct major components exchange because it hasn't been undertaken. So that's the end of my presentation, and I hope you find this is useful, and I'll pass it back to Sean.
Thank you very much, Yuan, for a great presentation. We've got some time now for Q&A, and we've got a couple of questions already, but I would encourage anyone on this call to ask a question. It could be you just want to make a comment to be read out, or get somebody's opinion who's on the panel about a question that you may have. Just one comment before I start to read out the questions, which is talking of technical risk. And one thing I'd like to mention is that what ERM is recognizing, I did refer to safety earlier in this webinar, was what we've found is, and it sometimes gets onto the critical path of construction of offshore wind projects, is incorporating local safety regulations versus your own corporate requirements. And sometimes there's gaps between local safety regulations and your own company regulations, or vice versa. So some analysis needs to be done on what standards are applicable in the country that you're investing in, and how you can complete or remove any gaps required in your safety management systems. Right, the first question we have today is, it looks like it's one for you, Kathy. You talked about Equator Principle 4. It came into effect in October 2020, when there was a transition from Equator Principles 3. One of the key additions is climate change risk assessment. Can you briefly describe any other key changes? Yuan, you can come on to video as well too, because I think there's a question for you coming up. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Yes. Okay. Thanks for the question. So generally speaking, an updated EP4 came into effect with stronger standards and a broader scope, like human rights, climate change, biodiversity, and indigenous peoples are among the topics addressed in this new iteration. It also covers a wide range of financial products. And another change is about new standards for projects in OECD countries. So the Equator Principles distinguishes between projects in designated and non-designated countries. So where designated countries are high-income OECD countries, and non-designated countries are typically lower income countries. So at EP3, set standards for project development in non-designated countries, including compliance with IFC performance standards, but did not do so for designated countries. But EP4 amends this principle that to address the concerns that these domestic laws and regulations in designated countries may not meet this standard. So they are required to meet EP4 as well in designated countries. And another point on human rights. So in EP4, Equator Principle financial institutions are committed to respect human rights in accordance with we just mentioned UNGP's United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights by carrying out human rights due diligence on covered projects, while EP3 only required human rights due diligence alongside ESIA in limited high-risk circumstances. So EP4 requires an assessment of potential adverse human rights impacts for every project, regardless of whether the risk merits a full ESIA. And another point on biodiversity. So Equator Principle financial institutions, borrowers, are now prompt to share commercially non-sensitive project-specific biodiversity data with the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF. So it's a international research network for the biodiversity data endorsed by OECD. So just encourage more biodiversity data to be shared and monitored. And last point about indigenous people. So under EP3 and EP4, so all projects affecting indigenous people must undertake a process of informed consultation and participation, and must comply with the relevant law in host country obligations under and international law. And so the principle 5, stakeholder engagement, has been revised in EP4 to also address the special circumstances that require the free, prior, and informed consent of affected indigenous people. So these are some, key changes in EP4 compared to the last version of EP3 in 2013. Yeah, okay. I hope that's I addressed the question.
Great, thank you, Cassie, for that. We have got a couple more questions, and the first one I'll read out is, how is the insurance market adapting to cover these unique risks? So the risks that we're been talking about in both our presentations. So I can partially answer that. And what I'll say is some discussions I've had with insurance firms is they're increasingly concerned over climate change, particularly extreme weather events, and how they can affect the life and risk to projects and infrastructure. So we are seeing increasing requests for modeling of climate change effects. Sometimes it's triggered by EP4 requirements. Sometimes it's caused by other issues, but it could be increased flood risk, increased strength of typhoons, etc. So what it means in consequence is that potentially cover could reduce. The levels of cover could reduce and costs could go up. So is there anything, Kathy or Yuen, you would like to add to that answer on insurance?
Nothing from me.
Okay. All right, next question is more technical question. Due to growing demand of larger scale wind turbines, will the fleet of PIVs for offshore construction in China be able to sufficiently meet the demand in any upgrading work required? I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that one myself. Potentially, it makes it's logical to say as larger scale wind turbines are built that there will be upgrading work required to floating vehicles. But Yuen, could you add a little bit,
Yeah,
please?
I would say it is hard to say at the moment, just due to there's multi concepts of floating structures, and different structure may require different vessel minimum requirements. So the upgrade will depend on the floating structure selected by the developer, and I believe it's basically it's key to sort of invest the vessel market and chartering at early project development stage to make sure the vessel selected for the project can have the capability to lift or working on the floating structure. But I believe, the vessel demanding is increase based on the number of floating projects increase. So I predict it should be fine, but it's just the early involvement is quite important.
Okay, and thanks for that, because obviously we have to make some assumptions and give our opinion to answer a question like that. But thank you for your coverage of the answer there. Another question is, how is typhoon risk addressed in Asia, designed in Europe, where typhoons may be milder? Would you be able to answer that one?
Yeah, what I understand is typhoon has been covered by the insurance advisor, and in general, we consider the typhoon in the early energy yield assessment, but I'm not an expert in that. So it's only when during the construction and the operational phases, the vessel accessibility is quite important, and at the early stage of project development phase, it is also important to do the vessel access assessment and make sure there is enough load on the construction schedule. And also the extreme weather has been considered under the O&M contracts and warranted availability of turbine. Sean, back to you.
Yes, thank you. Just having a little technical issue, so I didn't hear the end of your question, but sorry, the end of your answer. But what I would add to what I did hear from you saying is that it's not as if offshore wind designers are not unaware of storms. You know, there's storms in the North Sea, there's storms all around the world. Typhoons are a different type of storm and can have higher speeds, etc. But the modeling and climate models and software available, I predict would be utilized to overcome some of the issues associated with typhoons. And it could be that certain types of offshore wind design become more common in Asia because of the issues associated with typhoons, and other types of design are less common or less utilized. And as we're at the earlier stage of offshore wind development here in Asia than we are in parts of Europe, there could be some quite significant changes in the type of offshore wind platforms and offshore wind turbines that are utilized across the region. Okay, I think we have answered all the questions that were raised, and so thanks to the people who asked questions. Unfortunately, there's no prize for asking a question, but you do get the satisfaction of getting your question answered. So thank you for answering that. And thank you for everybody who participated today and those who answered the polling questions. Gives us some interesting feedback. And as we said, the slides will be sent with a thank you email to all the attendees today. And finally, what I'd like to say is we'll just go on to the next slide just before we leave. There's a survey slide coming up. There it is. If you scan, oh, sorry, go back one, please. If you scan the survey slide, and any feedback you can give on our webinars would be much appreciated. And on that, we'll just leave that open for a little bit longer, a few more seconds, and then we'll say a final thank you. And I'll go back to video because I think I'm working again. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you very much, particularly to our two presenters who did a wonderful job. Thanks everyone, and hope to hear from you with further questions or inquiries as a consequence of this webinar.
Okay.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Time for the music.
Thank you. Bye.
Share everyone.
Thank you. Bye.